this idea that Trump is getting more popular is really stupid.
Yeah.
Like the media buying these polls that he's getting more popular and stuff. Like, what are you talking about? I have no idea how you people are buying these polls that aren't showing, they're not showing up in reality, right? Like you mentioned earlier, the vote in Ohio, the vote in Virginia, the vote in Kentucky, the vote in Pennsylvania, for crying out loud. None of the fruit is bearing from these polls that
even the vote, like people look at the wins and not even the vote in Mississippi.
Right.
We lost by 3.5 points in a plus 15 or 16 Republican state. That means we gained 12 to 13 points on what they should have won by.
On an off year, which is wildly unexpected.
Yes, the fact that we came close to winning the governorship of Mississippi says a lot, as much as anything else that we just mentioned. So I mean, and that, as you said, that we had an incumbent, but still that we won in Kentucky and held on. I mean, that's what I mean. And then that same night, CNN was showing their stupid poll they just come out with, that I was sitting there looking at, and I was like, if they cared about anything but clicks and people watching their channel or whatever, you can look at these polls, and all you have to do is look at the first couple breakdowns demographically, and you'll know that they're full of right away. Because right away when they come to you and they're like, Biden is only up by 9 points among minority voters, and he won them by 45 points in 2020. Yeah, that's not accurate. I don't know what you're asking and who you're asking and how you're doing it, but you start looking at those internals and you're just like, this is garbage. I'm willing to admit Trump's closer than he ever should be, and that Biden's not way ahead, which is distressing just because of what it says about our country. But if you sit there and you look at numbers as they should be, Biden's ahead, and he's ahead in key states. And we still have to do our part because they'll throw everything at him, and we have to come out and make sure. And it should be a 45 state landslide. Like, it shouldn't even. But I have hope. As much as I rip the media, it seems like the people like you and me, and there's a lot of us, and other journalists, columnists who've been ripping the New York Times and the Washington Post, they finally did it. They finally started using the F word for Trump and pointing out that he's a fascist. And there's a big article in the Washington Post comparing his rhetoric to Hitler's. And the New York Times had a headline, and for once, and it started talking about fascism. I think they are feeling the pressure finally, where all the rest of us are like, we had enough of this, and we're not going to sit here and take it. If you sit here and you try to cleanse this thing and act like this is some little Democrat versus Republican, fight, and there's not broader implications here about our democracy and women's basic rights, well, then you, I'm going to rip you in every forum and every place I can. And I kind of feel like that's the way a lot of us have. We're just tired of it. And I think it's worked. So it doesn't mean they're going to be perfect. They're going to still suck by nature, because they do. But even if they're a lot better in sort of sharing the stakes, I've said this before, and I have to believe it's really important where you are too. Where I am, Tony. I mean, I'm in Cincinnati, and our newspaper takes a lot of cues from what the New York Times does. How the New York Times portrays things affects newspapers in smaller cities around the country. It's kind of like they give them kind of like this is the way it should be kind of thing. And whether they do it overtly or they just do it, they end up picking up the New York Times spin. So it's a really important thing that those guys are getting at least something right. So I have some hope.
Well, and back to the journalism thing, and people, these mainstream journalists calling him a fascist. My audience knows that I'm not very easy on Joe Scarborough. That I like to pick on Joe Scarborough a little bit. A morning show. Well, I mean, Joe Scarborough thinks he's so smart, but he's not as smart as he thinks he is. But he's been calling Trump a fascist here lately, and I'm glad that Joe is finally coming to his senses. But the right is freaking out that on Morning Joe that they're calling Trump a fascist. Yeah. And of course, I've been calling him a Nazi for many, many years now, and I've been calling Republicans many years.
We've been trying to push that so that people like Joe Scarborough will do it. And again, I'm no Scarborough watcher. I've got numerous issues, frankly. But the important thing is that is a show that sets the tone, that places like, Politico and others get, their marching orders from, again, whether it's overt or not. They see that and they're like, oh, that's what we should be talking about today. And it doesn't matter whether it's fair or not, it's reality, right? And so the fact that Scarborough took something like an 8-minute segment, I mean, it wasn't just a short drive-by either. It was a long segment, and he sat there and he was going through the New York Times piece. And that's kind of my point about the New York Times. That's the influence they have. He was going through their piece and saying, well, dehumanizes the opposition. Check, right? He uses, wants to call in the military in civilian populations. Check. Like all the different ways Trump checked different boxes for being a fascist. And so when you get an 8-minute segment like that on Morning Joe, and when you get then a New York Times front page article on how he's echoing, other authoritarian leaders in history, and they use the word fascist in the article, and when you get the Washington Post going even further and saying, making a comparison of his rhetoric to Hitler's in one of their articles, then that means we've done something, we've changed something, because they weren't doing any of this stuff before.